Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 357. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to get through on today's show, but first I want to remind everybody we are hosting our winter fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. Scott Horton is the director of the Institute. He employs myself, Keith Knight, Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Lori Calhoun, Connor Freeman, and others to write articles, produce books, podcasts, so much great content for the liberty movement. So if you want to help, myself and Connor continue to improve this show, put out new shows, think about heading over to libertarianinstitute.org today and making a donation. We would really appreciate it. Other than that, you find the show at antiwar.com and the rest of the plugs. Just if you want some CBD, get it at Paloma Verde. Use the promo code PEACE. Help yourself out by getting a discount and help out the show because we get a kickback. All right, let's get into it. First story today. Australian Prime Minister tells U.S. to drop charges against Julian Assange. The Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, on Wednesday said that he has personally asked the U.S. government to drop the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who is an Australian citizen. Albanese, who previously rejected public pressure to push Assange's release, said that he raised the issue with U.S. officials in a recent meeting. The government will continue to act in a diplomatic way, but I can assure the member that I have raised this personally with representatives of the U.S. government. My position is clear, and it has been made clear to the U.S. administration that it's time for this matter to be brought to a close. Now, there's always some questions of how high-ranking has Australia brought this up the ladder and everything, but I think this is actually a lot better news than the international letter we got from the news outlets. As me and Misty explained on the episode we just did last Wednesday on this show about the letter from the New York Times, the Guardian, and the others international outlets, they've done so much to add to the persecution of Julian Assange that they really want to help Assange. They really need to do some journalism, some actual work, and help their readers understand what Julian Assange's actual role and actions have been over the past several years, rather than this villain they've incorrectly portrayed him as. Well, Albanese doesn't have that dark stain, but also, Australia is a pretty critical ally in the U.S., for the future foreign policy that our think tankers perceive, that we had this great power competition we had to fight against China. Australia is key in that. And so, maybe somewhere in the U.S. government, they figure they have to kind of give in to the Australians on this or something. So I do think this is better news. Now, and maybe even a slightly better piece of news, today, or I guess this is Sunday, December 4th. I'm not sure when Musk started this poll, but he said he agreed to do a poll asking if Assange and Snowden should be pardoned. That's Edward Snowden. Now, of course, legally, Assange doesn't need a pardon. He just needs the U.S. to drop the charges because he's a foreign citizen. But whatever. You get the gist of the poll. And it's something like 80% of the 2 million respondents voted to free those men. And so that's pretty key. And maybe that's the kind of thing that'll wake some U.S. politicians up and realize that, hey, there's a benefit for them to starting to adopt this position. Next story here, U.S. officials pushing for military intervention in Haiti. So remember back to the summer of 2021 in July, the president, Jovenel Moïse of Haiti, was assassinated. Not exactly clear who the assassins are, but there is some pretty strong evidence that the acting prime minister of the country's de facto leader now, Ariel Henry, has been involved in that assassination. But anyway, since he took power, the country has really dissolved into chaos. The capital city there is controlled by multiple warring gangs. But to make matters worse, the U.S. is now looking for military intervention. And so this is really absurd and really dangerous. The Dave DeCamp writes, some top Biden administration officials are pushing for international military intervention in Haiti over concerns of a migration crisis, the New York Times reported on Tuesday. The government of acting Prime Minister Henry has been under pressure over growing gang violence in the country and from demonstrators that are demanding Henry resign. Henry requested for a military intervention last month to break a blockade of key Ford fuel terminal in Port-au-Prince, but the Haitian National Police has since broken the blockade. The U.S. proposed a UN resolution calling for a foreign military to enter Haiti after Henry's request, but struggled to find a country willing to lead the intervention. The Times report said that the Biden administration wants to see military intervention in the country. They don't want to involve U.S. troops, though. The U.S. said that the deployment of 2,500 troops and police officers could be enough to ensure that key areas in Haiti are secured, but the countries the U.S. has looked to lead the intervention are hesitant, including Canada and Brazil. And if you'll remember, about a month ago, myself and Will Porter wrote an article for the Libertarian Institute that the Secretary of State Antony Blinken was going to travel to, I believe, Ottawa or Toronto and meet with some high-ranking Canadian officials and try to really pressure them into leading this. And it seems Canada has continued to resist. While Haitians are facing violence and food shortages, most people in the country are against intervention due to the country's dark history with foreign military occupants. The most recent UN peacekeeping deployment that ended in 2017 involved extensive human rights abuses, including the sexual assault of other underage girls and a cholera outbreak. And to go into a little bit more detail here, because I've written in this on the past, one of the real problems you have with UN peacekeepers is that they're deployed to these countries and they know that they could essentially act lawlessly, but the people of those countries don't understand. So, they meet women. So a UN peacekeeper from, wherever, the Uganda, Canada, Serbia, whatever, ends up in Haiti, and they have sex with a woman. They say, "Oh, baby, I'm take care of you," and the baby that comes from this and everything. Well, then the peacekeepers redeploy, and there's never been an instance of any peacekeeper actually having to take any responsibility for those kids. And so, they just leave huge, all these kids who have no fathers, left with these mothers who had no means to support them in these impoverished countries. And that's, most likely we're going to see more of that. A report from NPR in November found that most Haitians opposed foreign military intervention. They brought up kidnappings and rape and cholera. A protest organizer told NPR that the UN peacekeeper deployment, if the UN sends troops to Haiti, the fighting will get even more intense. So, this is all really bad news, and my guess is that I really am not going to have better news in the future on Haiti. I think that, the path of that country right now, particularly after the U.S. put this, I think, very illegitimate power holder, Ariel Henry, because it really was the U.S. Pressure that led Claude Joseph, who was the prime minister after Mosley was assassinated, to step down and give that position to Henry, because he's been so illegitimate that the country has devolved into chaos. And so that if that doesn't get better, then there's only going to be more mounting pressure for Western, particularly U.S. Canadian intervention. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but we will see. Next article I wrote for Antiwar.com on December 2nd. Zelensky looks to ban Christian denomination with ties to Moscow. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced he is seeking to ban all religions with ties to Russia. He claims the move is needed to guarantee the spiritual independence of Ukraine. This law will target millions of Ukrainians who identify as Russian Orthodox. During his nightly address on Thursday, Zelensky announced he was introducing legislation that would eliminate religious organizations affiliated with Russia from operating in Ukraine. He says this will make it impossible for religious organizations affiliated with centers of influence in the Russian Federation to operate in Ukraine. The Ukrainian leader said it was necessary to purge the church to preserve the country's spiritual independence, adding, "We will never allow anyone to build an empire inside the Ukrainian soul." Zelensky denounced Ukrainians continuing to attend parishes that are loyal to the Russian patriarchal denomination of Eastern Orthodox as failing to overcome the temptations of evil. He claimed a series of recent raids by Kiev's intelligence found Orthodox churches which remained connected to the Moscow parachute have been acting as operatives for the Kremlin. In his address, Zelensky instructed his security forces to target more Russian Orthodox parishes. Around 2/3 of Ukrainians identify as Eastern Orthodox Christians. At one point, the majority of Ukrainians attended parishes that followed the Moscow branch. Some recent polls say that number has dwindled to under 15%. However, the polling was only conducted in territory that was controlled by Ukrainian forces, and Zelensky has vowed to return all those regions to Kiev's authority. So I think there's some problem with these polls just based on that, these are mostly Kiev-based polling agencies, and so they might have some bias cooked into those numbers anyways. And so it may not be that, only 4% of Ukrainians who live under current control of Kiev actually are Russian. That number could be much higher. However, they say that number is only 4%, but all the territory that's held by Russia, they're not pulling the people there. And those are the people that tend to be Russian Orthodox, and Zelensky is saying that he's going to take all that territory back. And so this was, I think, attempted to be downplayed in the Western press as, this will only affect a few Ukrainians. It's going to be millions of Ukrainians. Even if it's only 4%, that is still well over 1 million Ukrainians that are going to be impacted here. Again, my guess is that number is much higher. But if Zelensky has his way and retakes all of Ukraine, this is going to be, tens of millions of people whose religion is effectively outlawed by this. Last thing, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, responded by slamming Zelensky's move as authoritarian. The current Ukrainian authorities have openly become enemies of Christ and the Orthodox faith, he said. Now, let's talk about talks. Biden says he has no immediate plans to contact Putin. This from Dave DeCamp on December 1st. President Biden said on Thursday he has no plans to contact Russian President Vladimir Putin, but he'd be willing to talk with the Russian leader if he was prepared to end the war in Ukraine. I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin, Biden said at a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron, who was visiting the White House. I am prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if there is in fact interest in him deciding he is looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. So this comment could be interpreted as positive, and I kind of almost want to say, yeah, this is great. However, this almost, I feel like, is touching on that North Korea policy where, we're willing to talk to the North Koreans when they give up their nukes. Well, North Korea is never going to give up their nukes. And so that means, this is actually a red line for diplomacy. So if you're saying that Putin has to essentially admit he's lost the war and come crawling to the table for the U.S. to talk, well, that's not going to happen. So he's really not in any way opening the door for talks here. But maybe I'm just being a little cynical with that interpretation. Either way, Russia has maintained that it's open to talks with the U.S. and Ukraine about the war, but there is little chance Putin and Biden will be anywhere close on what they think is an acceptable peace deal to end the fighting. And, that is a really important point and something we talk about on the show a lot, that diplomacy, climbs up the ladder most of the time. And so it's not that, you just had the two leaders who get to meet. You have several meetings of lower level officials over the course of, days, weeks, but probably months. And eventually, they work out and hammer out almost all the details. So when the two leaders get together, most of what they're doing is signing the document, if not maybe, discussing the last major issue or something like that. But, the deal should be pretty much finalized between the leaders meet. Russia said U.S. NATO directly involved in Ukraine war. This from Dave DeCamp on December 1st. U.S. and NATO are directly involved in the war in Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said on Thursday, you shouldn't say that this is the U.S. and NATO who are taking part in this war. You are directly participating in it, Lavrov said at a press conference, and not just providing weapons, but also training personnel. You're training the military and on your territory, on the territories of Britain, Germany, Italy, and other countries. Lavrov made the comments while defending Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, which have left millions of civilians without power and heat as temperatures are dropping, as Ukraine is entering winter here. So I think Lavrov's statements are pretty much correct in that the U.S. is a party to this conflict, and that's part of the reason why the U.S. and Russia need to talk to end this thing. Now, maybe a little bit of positive news here to wrap up the Russia section. Rep. Adam Smith says calls for Ukraine aid oversight are Russian propaganda. And so I think he's overplaying his hand here. I really do. I think this sounds stupid to say that wanting to know where the weapons and money the U.S. is sending to Ukraine is going is just Russian propaganda. I mean, I don't know. It just sounds foolish. So the head of the House Armed Services Committee said Saturday that the growing calls for more oversight of the billions of dollars the U.S. is sending to Ukraine are part of Russian propaganda. While the majority of Republicans strongly favor continuing to arm Ukraine, even the more hawkish GOP members said they increasingly favor oversight for the aid. Smith said the concern from Republicans for transparency makes me a little bit crazy. Ukraine is spending the money really well. That's why they're winning, Smith said at the Reagan National Defense Forum, according to Defense News. Yes, we need oversight, but we don't need an excuse to not fund what we're doing. And so this is ridiculous. And again, I think this is just transparently stupid. And so, even Americans who don't really pay attention to the news, if you hear your congressman saying that you're a Russian propagandist for merely wanting to know where your tax dollars are going, it might not play so well. Now, I want to get into some China news, but this from Lavrov, I think it's at the same press conference on Thursday. China is stepping up. Russia and China are stepping up military cooperation in response to NATO. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said Thursday that the U.S. and NATO's moves to focus on countering China in the Asia Pacific has led to an increased military cooperation between Moscow and Beijing. We know how serious the People's Republic of China regards the provocations by NATO in the South China Sea, let alone Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. We understand that this is playing with fire by NATO in part of the world that carries threats and risks for the Russian Federation, Lavrov said. In recent years, the U.S. has stepped up its military presence in the South China Sea and near Taiwan, and some of its European allies have sent ships in the region, including the UK, France, and Germany. It's as close to our shores and our seas as it is to Chinese territory, so our military cooperation with the People's Republic of China is developing. We are holding joint exercises, but counter-terrorism exercises and air patrolling. NATO has identified China as a challenge to the alliance and said that it should forge stronger relationships with countries in the Asia Pacific, and they're currently looking at making Taiwan a major non-NATO ally of the U.S. So this would be pretty serious, and I believe China and Russia just carried out joint drills landing strategic bombers in each other's countries. So that's a pretty significant increase in military ties between those two countries. Now on to strictly China news. Draft National Defense Authorization Act includes $3 billion in annual military aid for Taiwan. A draft of the 2023 NDAA includes billions in military aid for Taiwan, but Congress isn't sure if the funds will be approved. The funding includes $10 billion in the State Department for a military financing program over 5 years, giving Taiwan $2 billion each year until 2027. It also includes $1 billion in annual presidential drawdown authority, which would allow the U.S. to send arms to Taiwan directly from U.S. stockpiles, the most common method of the U.S. Is using to arm Taiwan. And so I would be interested in how much of that PDA is a slush fund versus how much Congress really does get to earmark. Say, are they just putting another $1 billion into that presidential drawdown authority, which then could be used by the White House to send those weapons to Kiev, or is it very specific to Taiwan? I'm not really sure about that. I'm going to look into it and try to figure that out. My guess is that probably just about acts like a slush fund. And it would be really concerning if Taiwan starts receiving $3 billion a year from the U.S., as we've seen with countries like Israel. Even when they, as they become wealthy and very well armed, they never give up that military aid. And it really doesn't help the U.S. have any more influence or anything like that. It's just giving away taxpayer dollars that, then our politicians tell us we have to keep giving away. All right, now let's get into some of those provocative things that the U.S. is doing in Chinese claimed waters. U.S. warship sails near disputed Spratly Islands in South China Sea. A U.S. guided missile destroyer sailed near the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea on Tuesday in the latest U.S. challenge to Beijing's claims in the region. China's military said the vessel, the USS Chancellorsville, entered the area illegally, a claim disputed by the U.S. military. The U.S. Navy 7th Fleet said the PLA statement is false and insisted that the passage followed international law. China does have some very bold claims about what kind of like water territory that they actually hold, especially in the South China Sea. However, if you look at other countries around the world, they do pretty similar things where, they claim territories hundreds of miles from the main part of their country, and then they claim, large swaths and large ability to control all that territory in between. And so it's not necessarily something that's unique to Beijing, although this is a uniquely pretty ridiculous claim. Nonetheless, it's not on the U.S. military to enforce whatever the rules should be as to who controls what waters in the South China Sea. We're on the opposite side of the world, so it's just none of our business. And China should be able to balance this with its neighbors, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., who have these competing claims. All right. Pentagon says China could have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. The Pentagon this week issued its annual report on Chinese military power and claimed that Beijing could nearly quadruple its nuclear stockpile by 2035, bringing the total to 1,500 warheads, which they don't mention this, but is a quarter of the U.S. stockpile. And I believe less nuclear weapons are about the number of nuclear weapons that the U.S. has actively deployed. So while, they're making a big deal out of the numbers saying that, it's going to quadruple, it's still not that big. And of course, I do think that arms control with China would be possible, but the U.S. has shown it's not interested in arms control, making agreements, and then certainly not living up to them once it's the case. And then, so we had that NATO summit last week of the foreign ministers of the 30 states, and there was, Ukraine. I'm sure there's a Georgian representative there. The Nordic countries looking to join. So, there's more than just the 30 foreign ministers, but there's a huge number of Western foreign ministers at this summit. And then the foreign ministers discussed ways to confront what they called the challenge posed by China at that summit. And so this is pretty concerning. Blinken said, what we talked about today is working in concrete ways to meet the challenge. And again, this is the North Atlantic Alliance now focusing on Southeast Asia and what we're going to do about the rise of China. And so it's well out of NATO's purview. The U.S. is probably going to have to do a lot to get all of its allies to come along on this. But more importantly, it's going to be very provocative towards China and push Moscow and Beijing closer together. Next up, moving on to some Korea news before we wrap up here. U.S. South Korea plan to expand Silent Shark drills. Washington and Seoul are reportedly discussing plans to ramp up anti-submarine military exercises set to begin next year. The talks come amid soaring tensions in the region and just days before North Korea pledged to develop its nuclear arsenal. While the details of the biannual Silent Shark drills remain undecided, they are set to be bigger than those in the past, given North Korea's heightened tensions with his dozens of military missile tests in recent months. the Korean Times reported last week, citing an unnamed Navy official. Seoul has claimed the exercises are needed to contain the growing threat from Pyongyang, saying it will focus on anti-submarine warfare assets and are designed to improve the capability to respond to increasing North Korean submarine threats, including submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In October, the DPRK said it had successfully test-fired a KN-23 SLBM modeled on the Russian Islander missile as part of its a flurry of missile tests that is carried out in retaliation to joint U.S. and South Korean war games. The nuclear-capable KN-23 was launched from a special underwater reserve, prompting speculation that Pyongyang may have developed a new launch platform for the weapon. Military activity on the Korean Peninsula has reached a multi-year high in 2022, with North Korea conducting a record number of missile tests, including 2 ICBM launches last month, November. The U.S. and South Korea, for their part, had deployed additional strategic assets to the region and have carried out several rounds of live-fire military exercises, hoping to drive a cycle of escalation with the North. Earlier this month, Washington flew nuclear-capable long-range B-1B stealth bombers over Korea during its Vigilant Storm drills as a show for it to Pyongyang. The U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff C.Q. Brown Jr. downplayed the maneuvers as just a part of the exercise. The DPRK has repeatedly denounced such drills as provocative, viewing them as preparations for attack. In addition to the continued missile, rocket, and artillery tests, North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un has pledged to further develop his country's nuclear capabilities in responding to the growing tension, saying that military would work to improve its nuclear forces at the fastest possible speed back in April. More recently, Kim claimed North Korean scientists had made a wonderful leap forward in the development of technology of mounting nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles, going on to say Pyongyang would create the world's most powerful strategic force, the absolute force unprecedented in this century. So, in response, the U.S. is issuing new sanctions on North Korea. Of course, everything North Korean is already sanctioned to the mats to the most part, so it will have little impact, as Dave DeCamp writes, but he says it will ensure tensions remain high because this will be seen as North Korea as another provocation. So my guess is we'll see another North Korean response, and then Washington and Seoul will get together probably with Tokyo and say, oh my God, we got to do something about these crazy North Koreans, and then they'll conduct more war games. So this is a never-ending cycle of escalation. It's going to be a huge mess, but the White House has no idea to get out of it. So I don't see this winding down anytime soon. It's going to continue to unravel and create more problems. So anyways, thank you all so much. Just want to remind you, if you can, head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation. But everybody, thank you so much for the support for the show. Again, let me know how the new mic sounded. And yeah, anything else? I'm always open to questions, comments, whatever you got. You can find me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. Thanks, everyone.